Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Madam Speaker, and he was expressing concerns over this legislation, and I was talking to him about how we've developed the legislation. One of his concerns was in terms of the consultation process that was used, and maybe the Parliamentary Secretary could highlight how the legislation was developed in concert with union and business.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thanks to the Honourable Member from Guelph for the really great question, and I always appreciate Perrin Beatty's interventions and sometimes critique of the work of our government. I always find his comments very useful and helpful. But just to clarify, my understanding is that there were 57 stakeholder organizations that came together around 5 roundtables where you had labor organizations and unions sitting down with major employers. The sectors that were represented were telecommunications, air, marine, rail transportation, courier, and postal services. All participated in the roundtables, and all of the major unions participated. There were 71 written submissions, 45 personal stories, individual comments made, and then a What We Heard report, which was published. So all of the work to do proper consultation was done in the lead up to the tabling of C-58, and that's why this bill is so, I think, significant. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to bring the voices of Chatham-Kent-Leamington to this chamber. As I rise today to speak to Bill C-58, an act to amend the Canada Labour Code and the Canada Industrial Relations Board Regulations 2012. This bill would, of course, amend Part 1 of the Canada Labour Code and the Industrial Board Regulations to prohibit the use of replacement workers and improve the process of protecting against the immediate and serious danger to public health, safety, during a legal strike or lockout. More specifically, the bill would prohibit employers from using new hires or contractors to replace striking workers. In addition, they could also not use members of that very same bargaining unit that was on strike or in a lockout position. There are 2 exceptions provided for in the bill. First, employers would be able to use those replacement workers in a strike or lockout if it was necessary, and this is important, to protect the life and the health and safety and as well as destruction or damage to the employer's property or premises, or to protect against serious environmental damage affecting those premises. And secondly, of course, the employer could use employees within the bargaining unit to prevent that same list of circumstances that I just outlined. Madam Speaker, when I commute to Ottawa, I fly in and out of Windsor. And so my flight path almost always takes me, depending which way the wind blows, over the new battery plant being built in Windsor, the Stellantis plant. And in fact, on Friday, so a few days ago, I toured one of the buildings with this new plant with the leader of the official opposition and my friend, the member from Essex. This building was being erected by a local third-generation family-owned construction company, the Versatis, with a strong, unionized, industrious, local workforce. So I find it a bit ironic that we're debating this legislation today, C-58, when this government committed $15 billion of Canadian taxpayer funds for a battery plant that is hiring foreign replacement workers. You can make the argument that this is not the very same worker. The point is, this is $15 billion of taxpayer funds. And that's going to cost every family in Canada $1,000 while leaving our union workers out in the cold. And we can debate the semantics of whether that's a replacement worker or not. I also find it ironic that this legislation would ban the use of replacement workers in ban the use of, ban the use of replacement workers in federally regulated workplaces, but this legislation is not being extended to the public sector unions. And in those situations, the federal government is a party to the negotiation process. Isn't that a bit curious, Madam Speaker? Last November, we also learned that the Liberals are allowing the companies like Nexstar and Northvolt to also bring in hundreds of foreign workers to help build electric vehicles in Windsor and Quebec. Not surprisingly, the government has received a major pushback from our unions on this. To quote Sean Strickland, the executive director from one of Canada's building trades unions, he has called the situation unconscionable and said that bringing in 900 foreign workers is well beyond the standards his organization has ever seen. Madam Speaker, Conservatives will always stand up for workers, for Canadian workers. In fact, Madam Speaker, we tabled a motion in November at this House Government Operations Committee to compel the government to be transparent with Canadians once and for all and publish the contracts for the 2 battery plant deals, as well as the 3 others that have received the promise of federal subsidies. Of course, Liberal members on the committee objected. The honourable member from Regina Capel compared this situation to shareholders demanding to hold a company's CEO accountable. By shareholders here, we of course mean the Canadian taxpayer. And by the company's CEO, we mean the Prime Minister of Canada. And he said, quote, "Foreign replacement workers coming to Canada thanks to taxpayer subsidies is of interest not only to the workers in the area, but to every single Canadian family whose tax bill is underwriting this," end quote. A further example of taxpayer underwriting government overspending is, of course, the Arrive Scam Act. They gave $20 million, a $20 million contract to GC Strategies, a 2-person IT firm, or is it 4-person, doesn't really matter, that does no actual IT work. And the government cannot confirm how much the company has received. While we've learned that GC Strategies has received $250 million in consulting contracts since 2015, why didn't the Prime Minister go out and hire another 600 border guards to address the car theft that we're experiencing, or the import of handguns or drugs from across the border? Wouldn't that have been $60 billion far better spent? Madam Speaker, it's never been clearer that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Madam Speaker, I'm a Conservative, and so I believe that the market mechanism is the most efficient means by which to transfer the value of goods and services. And services includes things like labor required in almost every sector of our economy. But markets only function best and are sustainable over time when there is a balance of power across the negotiating table, where these goods and services are being established. Too much power on one side or the other distorts the process, leads to unfair outcomes and unsustainability over time. Collective bargaining is one of those such structures that has developed over time to bring some balance to the negotiating table. And that's just obviously used in many sectors in our economy. Prior to being elected, I served and participated in a form of such bargaining on behalf of vegetable producers, processing vegetable producers, in annual negotiations with processors to establish pre-plant contracts for the terms and conditions of sale for a particular vegetable crop each and every season. And you know what? We didn't always agree. So then what? Well, a strike or a lockout really wasn't an option for either the processors or the growers, as it's Mother Nature that dictates, through the seasonality of our Canadian climate, when the crops need to be planted and harvested. And the certainty of a pre-plant contract was vital for both processors and producers so that they were assured of a supply for the processors and the opportunity of a fair return for the producers. So an alternative form of dispute resolution was needed to be found in the event that contract negotiations were not agreed upon during the pre-approved upon deadline. It's hard to say. For many years, the industry used the final offer selection arbitration process as this dispute settling mechanism. And as unpleasant as any arbitration ever is, the system worked and worked well for many years for several reasons. One, because it was fair. And secondly, let me explain how it worked. It worked well because it drove good negotiations, which I believe is the goal of all processes to establish fair values, be it for a tomato crop or for an hourly wage. In the event that 2 parties to a contract talk could not agree at a specified predetermined time, they flipped final offers, and at that time both parties submitted their final offer to an arbitrator or to a panel of arbitrators of all the outstanding disputed items in the contract. Thereafter, sometimes after a period of conciliation or mediation, an arbitrator or panel of arbitrators had to pick, and here's the key to it, had to pick one party's position in its entirety. They could not, quote, split the baby in half. And herein lies the beauty of the system. If either party submitted an unreasonable or indefensible position, even on one particular aspect of the contract, they risked an arbitrator picking the other party's position. So in effect, what the final offer selection process does is that it drives good negotiations to settle at the table where the best agreements are always made, rather than risk an arbitration process. Let me be clear. Canadian workers have the right to collectively bargain and to determine fair value for their work. And it is inevitable that not all such bargaining situations will end in an immediate agreement. C-58 sets out one option in the event that a strike situation occurs. Of course, unions will argue that the option for replacement workers tips the balance of power too much toward the employers, while employers will state that the lack of such an option will lengthen strikes and jeopardize so much of the critical facets of our economy and thus hurting the Canadian public. In another setting, as I've explained, I've personally experienced a different option, final offer arbitration, and that has worked to settle disputes, allow crops to be planted and harvested on time without disrupting or losing a season. Improved labor relations should be the goal of any and every government, and having good labor relations is ultimately what's best for our country, for workers and employers. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the continuation of the debate and to see if Bill C-58 is the right tool in the right circumstances, and I look forward to questions for my colleagues. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North, the Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm actually very familiar with final offer selection. As I indicated previously, it was a great debate during the 88 to, let's say, 90, 91 in the Manitoba legislature, where we had a sunset clause in final offer selection legislation, and it was ultimately a compromise by then NDP Howard Pauley, as opposed to bringing in anti-scab legislation, was to have final offer selection. It's an interesting story. Not enough time to talk about it, but I'm very much interested in the member's actual position on this legislation. Does the member support the legislation going to committee?
The Honourable Member from Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Mr. Speaker, what I enjoy about this place is that we have the opportunity to debate. And I've listened to speeches today, and I've actually gone back on the previous days and read through other speeches, and I am still learning about the nuances of the particular sector. As I explained, I have had experience in, it's an agriculture situation where imposed deadlines were imposed by a force that growers and processors both acknowledged, and so there was a process developed to address that. Final offer arbitration, I'm glad the member opposite is so familiar with it. I have the opportunity to meet with many groups, not just from agriculture, as they come into my office. And I've talked with labor unions, I've talked with all sorts, and what I'm exploring here and listening through the debate is no one has yet told me how the final offer arbitration process is an unfair process to either labor side or to the employer side. That's the beauty of it. It actually drives a good negotiation as opposed to, I mean, the arbitration is always unpleasant, as are strikes and lockouts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
My colleague for his remarks. I share the Parliamentary Secretary's curiosity with regard to the Conservative Party's position on this legislation. They're still studying it at this late hour, and I guess it's going to be somewhat of a surprise, maybe a good surprise, maybe a bad surprise, when it comes to a vote. But my question is whether he has consulted with labor unions in his constituency on the topic of this bill, and if so, what message they brought to him with regard to banning replacement workers in strikes and lockouts.
Honourable Member from Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my colleague from across the way, across a good way across the country, for the question. And the answer, short and simple, is yes. I have had locals in my office. I have had different unions in my office, and I asked them that very, very question. I asked them, and I explained the arbitration process. Some are familiar with it, some aren't. And so I've asked them that question. Would that work in your situation? In full transparency, Mr. Speaker, the arbitration process was actually removed from the industry I spent 20 years from, not at the behest of the growers. It was actually removed at the behest of the processors, who would, in this situation, be in the employer role, whereas I actually collectively bargained on behalf of producers.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be simple for my Conservative colleague. In relation with this anti-strike breaker law, it seems that the Conservatives are against it. Can he confirm that if the Conservatives vote against it, it will be 18 months after that it comes into force? So if they were to take power, will they eliminate this law? The Honourable
Member from Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. No, I can't answer that question because where we're at right now, myself individually, is I'm in listening mode. I've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. I exercise the mouth for a